Alright, these are your notes for section 6.4 on completing the square, and in this video we're going to do two more examples of completing the square. You've already watched the video with all the skills. If you understand all the skills, then we're just going to combine them all and we're going to put them into solving these problems. Okay, so example number 1, x squared plus 2x minus 120 equals 0. Now remember, we need to have a blank, and this needs to get moved to the other side, so we're going to add 120 to both sides. So x squared plus 2x blank equals 120. Now it looks like one of the problems we've solved before. We cut this middle one in half. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And we square that, and it fills in our blank here. So 1, add 1 to the left. That means we have to add 1 to the right. Now I have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 120 plus 1 is 121. We're going to x back to the left, 1 on top, 2 on the bottom, two numbers that multiply to 1 but add to 2. Those are 1 and 1. Use our shortcut, x plus 1, which is really x plus 1 squared, and that equals 121. Rewrite this up here. X plus 1 squared equals 121. Now we take the square root of both sides. We can't forget that plus minus. Square and our square root cancel, so we're left with x plus 1 equals plus or minus. Well, the square root of 121 is really 11. So now we have plus or minus 11. Subtract 1 from both sides. Remember, this stays out in front, so minus 1 plus or minus 11. We have two answers there, negative 1 plus 11 and negative 1 minus 11. Well, negative 1 plus 11 is 10. And negative 1 minus 11 is negative 12. So there's the two answers to our problem, 10 and negative 12. And that's the completing the square process. What we've done is we've made the problem so it has a blank. We've completed the square so that we could factor it and get a perfect square in parentheses, and then we've solved it. So that's the completing the square process. Example 2 now. Example 2 is a little different. Notice in parentheses I say a does not equal 1. Okay, when we do a problem, a has to equal 1. A must equal 1. So we have to make it equal 1. That means we're going to divide everything by 2. Okay? This is make it. We're going to make it equal 1. Okay? So we just divide everything by whatever a is. That cancels out these, and we're left with x squared. Then we have minus, I'm going to make it 1.5x. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And 0 divided by 2 is 0. Okay? Now it's just like a problem we had in example 1. A is 1, we're good to go. So we're going to move the 3 over. We're left with x squared minus 1.5x, put a blank, equals 3. We cut this in half. Half of negative 1.5 is negative 0.75, and we're going to square that. Alright? Well, negative 0.75 squared ends up being 0.5625. Okay? Now, I'm going to do something here in a second that will help us figure this out. It'll help us in the long run, but right now I'm going to add 0.5625 to the other side also. So my new problem is x squared minus 1.5x plus 0.5625 equals 3.5625. I'm going to change this to a fraction, 0.5625, and your calculator will do that. You should know how to do that. It ends up that this is really 9/16. Okay? Now the reason I made it 9/16, I'll show you why here in a second. We have x squared minus 1.5x plus 9/16 equals 3.5625. I'm going to draw my x. 9/16 goes on the top. Negative 1.5 goes on the bottom. The reason I made it into a fraction is because if you noticed with completing the square, the two side numbers always have to be the same. I made it to a fraction because now I have a perfect square on top and a perfect square on bottom. I really need to figure out two numbers that multiply to 9, and those are 3 and 3. That gives me the numerator. And then two numbers that multiply to 16. That's 4 and 4. So there's my two side numbers. Okay? Does that make sense? I made it into a fraction so I could see better what two numbers my side numbers would be, because the sides have to be the same. They have to be identical to each other. And when it's a fraction, it's easier to see what two things I can multiply to get my fraction. And I split it up into the numerator and the denominator. There's one thing. Notice that this is negative. So these need to be negative fractions. Okay, so my two side numbers are negative 3/4 and negative 3/4. So now I have x minus 3/4, x minus 3/4, which is really x minus 3/4 squared, and that equals 3.5625. I'm going to rewrite this up here. X minus 3/4 squared equals 3.5625. Square root both sides. Need my plus minus. My square and my square root cancel. X minus 3/4 equals plus or minus. I'm going to figure out what that square root is as a decimal. So the square root of 3.5625. And when we do that, we get a weird decimal. That tells us that our fraction is not going to simplify, so we have to go back a step. We're going to make this into a fraction. Okay, 3.5625. We're going to make that into a fraction, and we end up getting 57/16. All right? So now we've got x minus 3/4 equals, we're going to rationalize this. So split it up. Plus or minus the square root of 57 over the square root of 16. Square root of 16 is really 4. So now this becomes x minus 3/4 equals plus or minus the square root of 57 over 4. Okay? So at this step, when we have a fraction under the radical, we need to make sure that we change that into a fraction, and then we go through and we rationalize that fraction under the radical sign. And it should, the denominator should be a perfect square, so it'll just cancel itself out. Now we're going to add 3/4 to the other side, so now we have 3/4 plus or minus the square root of 57 over 4. And there's the answers to our problem. 3/4 plus the square root of 57 over 4, and 3/4 minus the square root of 57 over 4. Those are the two answers to our problem. Now, I will warn you that is a difficult problem. Most of the problems you will see will not be that difficult. They'll come out with nicer answers. But, you know, life isn't perfect. You can get a messy answer like that. So expect it. Just anticipate it. If you don't get it, great. You'll have a problem that works out nice. If you get one with a messy answer, that's okay too. Now, if you have any questions on those, really what I want you to get is the skill, the process out of the video, okay? And if you have any questions, rewatch these examples, or again, go back and rewatch the other video on section 6.4 on knowing the skills, so that when you get to class, you can at least know the process. You may get funky answers, that's okay, but I want you to know the process.